All right, I wanted to get a video put together today for something in Autofac that a friend had asked me about. So if you're not familiar with Autofac, this might be maybe a little bit too advanced to get started with, but you might just be interested in following along because you've heard of Autofac. So if you're not totally familiar with what Autofac is, it's the dependency injection framework. I'm not sure if it's available outside of like the .NET land. Maybe there's other languages it's available for, but there's lots of different dependency injection frameworks. This is just one of them. It's my preferred one. It does a lot of really cool things, and it's really fun to explore. But essentially, what was being asked was a little bit more than I had thought on the surface. So I thought originally the question was, if I have a dependency that's part of my main application, and I want to introduce something like a plugin that can override a service and provide a new implementation, how do I go about doing that? And on the surface, I thought that's what it was. And I was like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure that's very straightforward in AutoFac. And in fact, it is. That's not what was being requested, though. But just to touch on that first, I'm going to kind of jump through some code here. So what I have in this solution is console app 2, just because I forgot to rename it to something more pleasant, but sort of your entry point. We have a shared project that just has an interface in it, something really trivial, something super simple. It just has an interface that has a single method on it to print something. And then I have two other projects, and each one of them is sort of an implementation of that service. So basically, if we assume that, forget that there's a new implementation project here, your original setup might be that even this original implementation project might be part of this core application. I have it separate just to keep it a little cleaner for conversation, but what you might have is sort of, a class. I just call it original because it's not very original. The original implementation of this service, and all that it does is it writes out a message to sort of the debug output. I have it to debug and not console, just so that when I'm streaming here, I can show you in this little output window down here. Um, anyway, it's essentially, call it equivalent to console write line there. And then what I'm doing in here is I'm also writing out the hash code of the object, not for any good reason, except that when we talk about some of these details, the hash code will tell us what reference of the object we're talking about, which as we get into some of the more complex scenarios, that might be kind of cool to see what's going on. So we have an original implementation, and then I have an Autofac module here, and all that it does is, again, if you're not familiar with Autofac, this might be a little bit too much too fast, but all that it's doing is registering that type. We're going to make it a single instance just for now, so that anytime someone's trying to resolve this, they'll keep getting the same instance back. And we're going to register it as the implemented interfaces. So the only way that someone can get this is when they ask for a service that is the interface, because I couldn't come up with any great names. And you can see that when I jump to this program. I have some commented out code here, so forget that for now. It's just I want to build on top of this conversation. So you'll see that we have a container builder. It is going to register our two modules. Like I said, I'm going to come back to this new implementation one in a second. I'm just kind of going over the framework here. So we register our assemblies, we make a container, we make the scope, and then we resolve the service, right? Because I was saying that we registered it as the implemented interfaces. So the only way we can get that thing out of our dependency container is by resolving it by the interface. And then I just call print message, and we just have a little thing at the end so we can press enter to exit. So anyway, really simple program. And what was being asked, I thought originally, was if I just want to override the implementation by essentially adding in a new module, because if we want to assume that the person is unable to sort of touch the main body of the application, and you just sort of want to override functionality by adding more code, how do you go about doing that? So essentially the way Autofac works is that if you have, I'm going to go back to this original module here. If I had another module that looked just like this, and instead of registering the original here, so we're doing this in the sort of the main module, and then if we had a second module that registered another type that also happened to meet the same interface, which is the interface, Autofac will basically the last person to make the registration is the one that will sort of take precedence. So that would mean that if we added a new module, registered a new type here, and then we did it also as implemented interfaces, and it had the same interface, that new module, as long as it was registered second, would sort of override the behavior. So just to illustrate that, if I had this order here, where I have the original one, that gets registered first, and then the new implementation, and if we assume that it had a very similar looking module and registered a new implementation with the same interface, what would happen is that when we resolve it and print the message, it would take the new behavior. So in fact, it's actually really simple to just override existing behavior simply by registering a module after, because Autofac will give precedence to the latest registered module. So that would be a pretty trivial thing. I thought that's what was being asked, so I was all excited to give the answer and say, hey, it's just this easy. But that's not what was being asked. It's similar, but a little more complicated. So what was being requested was not only do we want to do something just like that, but the new implementation is actually going to be a wrapper. And what I mean by that is the new implementation also needs to take in the original implementation, okay? But the catch is without knowing or without having a direct dependency on it. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing, and it's easier to step through the code and do it. So what I'm going to show you over here is this new implementation class, and you'll see that it also implements the interface. There's a little bit of extra stuff here. I have a magic number and whatever, and I'll get to that. That's really just to make the debug output look a little bit more telling as we're stepping through some stuff. But the new implementation also meets this interface, right? But it's going to take in another instance of the interface, and it wants to take in I'm calling it the original one, but that's where the trickery comes in. And you'll notice that if I check the dependencies here on the left, the new implementation, the only thing it depends on is this common interface. Okay, so it has no idea that this original implementation exists, right? So all that it's saying is when I am made, I want Autofac somehow, right, using some sort of sorcery, I want Autofac to give me an interface that's whatever the original one is, right? So whatever came from this project down here, I want that one passed in, and then we're going to override the behavior. So what I've done to make it a little bit more obvious when we override that behavior is we're going to print a message before, then we're going to call the one that we're wrapping, which should be the original functionality. And if I jump into what that is, remember it just says, I am the original implementation with this hash code. So we should see this message, then we should see this message, and I'm going to jump back one more time, and then we're going to follow up with this third message that says, print this magic number after the original. Okay, so the catch here is that I need the main application without touching it at all, right? Aside from registering a new module, that when I resolve this interface here, when I resolve it, I somehow need to override the original behavior. But when I override, that new behavior needs to take in the old behavior as well. It needs to wrap it. And that's something that Autofac can't do like right out of the box super easily. I figured out a way that makes it work with Autofac, and it's pretty cool, but I feel like there's a few gotchas that I still have to figure out. So I wanted to make a video to talk about it, but essentially we can't just, I'm going to jump back to this module, we can't just register the type like we did here in the new module and just hope that it works. And the reason why we can't just do that, you might be able to do it if you had like, if you were keying these or using names, which is an Autofac feature, but the assumption was that I was going by was that we can't touch this module. Okay, so whatever the original code was, we can't touch it. So that's a constraint we have to work with. And if we can't touch it, that means if it wasn't named or wasn't keyed, I can't do anything magical to work around that. And I somehow need the main application to just do the right thing. Okay, so gets a little weird, but it means that in our new module, we can't just register a new type and hope it works. And again, to reiterate why that doesn't work is because what Autofac will want to do, if I go to this new implementation, what Autofac will try to do is when someone requests this, right? So they're requesting the interface. When this thing goes to get constructed, it also needs the interface. It needs an instance of it. So what ends up happening is that I told you that the latest registered module will take precedence. It will go, okay, well, we need to pass in something that meets the interface, and it goes, well, new implementation does. Okay, so let's make a new one of those. What does it need? Oh, it needs the interface. And if you haven't caught on, it has a circular dependency. You'll have a Stack Overflow essentially. So it's not intelligent enough out of the box, and for I think good reasons. It's not intelligent enough out of the box to know how that you want sort of another implementation. How can it possibly decide? We have to tell it, right? So that's where we had to come up with a sort of an alternative solution for registering this and letting it take in sort of the original interface into this. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. The code right now has been sort of massaged a little bit. I was trying to make it a little bit prettier with some extension methods. Extension methods are heavily used in Autofac to give you a nice looking API. So I was trying to come up with something that felt pretty cool, but I'm not quite there yet. But I have it in this new module. So I'm going to collapse some of this code for now. But essentially, from Googling, I saw an example. The guy had referred to this technique as wiretapping, which I thought was kind of interesting. You're kind of putting a man in the middle, right? You want to intercept some registration behavior and kind of put a wrapper in place. So the interface, I'm going to step through the code that what this actually does, but I thought this was a semi-decent looking sort of API for it, but essentially we're going to say we want to wiretap when someone's requesting the interface. We actually want to give it this. Okay, so what's cool is that when this happens, I actually have this this function here that I don't know if I can't tell if you. I'm assuming you guys can't see the hover when I'm hovering over X here, but X in this example is actually the original instance that we'll be wrapping of the interface. So I managed to wire it up, no pun intended, so that we get the original one passed into this function, and then we can wrap it, and then that way when someone tries to resolve the interface, we sort of put the man in the middle. We've done the wiretap. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? I'm going to show you this set of extension methods here and talk about some of the things that felt good, some that felt bad, and what I'm trying to clean up still. So essentially, I know there's a bunch of code here. I want to highlight the one part in particular that sort of does the magic. And essentially what it comes down to is that there's this thing we can hook onto on the component registration. And this has an event that is called activating. Okay, and what we're doing is we're hooking up an event handler. Okay, so this was something I've never seen before, but I didn't actually know you could do this in C#, but I guess in C# 7 you can actually put literally a method body right in here. It's not quite the same as an anonymous method. And the cool thing that lets me do is actually unhook this. I've never seen this, but you can unhook the event handler, because when you have this syntax here, usually if you had an anonymous method, this would be null. It would say it's unset. But when you have this syntax, it actually knows that handler is sort of this method here, which is pretty cool. Anyway, this is just an event handler, and what we're able to do, again, there's a bunch of code, so don't worry about that too much. We're able to check up here. We're able to check if the thing that we're trying to register with is this type of T. And the type of T, I'm scrolling back up here, is I, the interface. So essentially what we're able to do is say, go get this registration, and we're going to hook up to this component registration so that when someone tries to activate the instance, which is really like they're trying to resolve an instance of this service, when it's activating, let's sort of intercept that, right? So what we're able to do is, again, ignore all of this stuff just for now, but what I'm able to do is call this function, called it wiretap callback, okay? And we pass in the instance that it was activating with, and instead we're able to return back and assign a new instance here to this event handler. So that's the main sort of fancy part of this. So it wasn't really a lot of code just to do the interception. Again, I'm going to touch on some of this code in a sec. One of the things about this syntax compared to some of the stuff I was seeing online was that I wanted an API that felt like you were interacting with the container builder, like you normally do in here for a lot of your setup. So usually, like in the other module, we saw builder, register type, and then we could have done like new implementation, right? You have this sort of syntax, which feels, in my opinion, really nice. We can do single instance as implemented interfaces. So like this feels really good. A lot of the modules I've written almost always look something, like these lines repeated with subtle differences. And I was like, when I go to do this, again, calling it wiretap, when I go to do this wiretapping, I want to have syntax that looks and feels like this. So I started with trying to look on the container builder to see how can I possibly get a component registration. I need to be able to pull that off of something. And I noticed that the normal register method on the container builder gives you a component context, and then you can do this little bit of magic here. So we can go find, it's called a typed service. So we can go find a registered service of the interface we're looking for, and then hook onto that. So that's how that got started. But the really crappy thing about register, and this is something I don't like, but it's kind of hidden from the API call, is that register actually requires that you return a type. It's just how that extension method works. And I went, oh crap, like this thing isn't actually doing a registration. I don't have a type that I need to return. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to make a hidden type that no one will ever see. It's private to this class. And I literally just called it private class ignore, and it returns a new one of those. And I said, great, cool, this will work. But it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because this code generally, I'm going to highlight it, but this registration code essentially only runs when someone tries to resolve a type. So you can see the problem here is that I said, I'm going to register a type that no one can even see. And as a result, no one can actually resolve it. So I said, crap, well, I'm stuck again. But I'm not, because there's this thing in Autofac called auto-activate. And auto-activate does exactly what it says. You don't have to wait for someone to resolve your type. You can auto-activate and basically force this registration to run. Other instances where I've used auto-activate might be for like, say like a service that or a controller that doesn't actually have anyone dependent on it. I just want to like sort of start something up and let it run. I use auto activate for things like that sometimes. But in this case, it was like, again, a little bit of like hidden magic that's like, I don't want anyone to try and resolve this type, so it has to be totally hidden, and then I have to force the activation. So that was a lot of talking. Let's see what this actually does. Okay, so jumping back to the program here, we should see the first thing written out is it says first resolved instance because we're going to show an example with another instance. So it'll print that. And what we should see is that we're intercepting the original implementation. So we should see the magic number line printed out and say before. We should see then the original message get printed out. And then we should have it followed up with a magic number after. So let's try it out. Compile faster, please and thank you. I feel like it should have already been compiled, but what do I know? There we go. Okay, so we got this debug stuff running here. The future run should go a little faster. So you'll see it says first resolved instance, right? So this message here is what we see up here. Then we get print 1 before original, and then the original message that has this hash code, 1 after original, and then press enter to exit. So you can see that we did in fact intercept it, which is pretty cool. And just to prove that, that we did an interception, if it wasn't already proven in your opinion, I'm going to comment out this line that does the wiretap, run it again, and we shouldn't see any magic number before and after. It should just say first resolved, the original, and then press enter to exit. Ideally, if everything works as I expect. Right, so first resolved instance, I'm the original, and obviously new hash code because it's a new run, and then press enter to exit. So this line does in fact do the wiretap for us, which is great. And that's mostly what I sort of needed as a basis. And then I was able to tell my friend, like, I have a way that you can get started with this. But then I got really curious and I was like, okay, well, Autofac's pretty powerful. What happens? Like, what does it mean if I don't want a single instance of things? The one thing I really don't like about this syntax is that it almost gets rid of some of the magic syntax of Autofac because I literally had to new something up. That's one of the things about Autofac that is super nice is that in a perfect world, you never have to type new on your implementations of things. You can just register the type and then the dependencies get activated by Autofac. So I didn't like the fact that I had to new something up here. The reason why that happens, though, is again boils down to, I'm going to jump into this, that this new implementation does require an interface instance, and as a result, it can't automatically figure that out. So that's something I still want to see if I can explore and get like. I'm just going to jump back to this new module. The syntax I would love to see here is like, forget the magic number thing for just a second, but this would feel like super cool if I could do like this. Like this syntax, in my opinion, would be awesome because you could say like wiretap when someone asks for this, just give them this, right? And then it would automatically know how to figure out like how to construct this and then like replace the interface. That's really what I'm after. This felt close enough. It doesn't feel too bad with this example only because there's not a lot of parameters to this. If this class had a ton of parameters or the couple parameters it had were hard to construct, this would start to feel bad really fast, but at least it gets you over that hurdle. So that's something I still want to address. But let's talk about some of the interesting things that you can do with this now. So, what would happen if someone said, "I want to do a double wiretap," right? So, like, what should this is this is where it gets interesting because it's like, what should even happen here? I coded this and I don't actually know what's truly expected. Um, and that's, I guess, one of the fun things about, like, you make this API and it's like, well, someone might accidentally code this, right? In a more complex example, they might accidentally code this, and maybe that's something you want to prevent. But maybe there's actually use cases where you want to keep wrapping and doing something else. So right now, if I go to run this, it does work. It's not going to throw an exception. But when I say it works, I don't know if this is truly what people would expect. Um, so I'll try to explain when this is printed out. But you can see that we have a wiretap with 1 in it and a wiretap with 2, and we never see the wiretap with 1. Right? So this 2 overrode this wiretap, the first one. My opinion on that is, like, that kind of feels right based on what the rest of Autofac does. Remember I was saying if you had a registration of a service and then you put another registration right after it, it will prioritize the second one and kind of let that override the first one. That's what's happening here. Whether or not that's good or not, I mean, at least it feels pretty consistent. So that's something. What if I had this code back in program here and I said I want to do multiple interfaces? Sorry, multiple. I said that totally wrong. I want to do multiple. Oh, it doesn't like that. There, I just want an empty line. I want to be able to do, resolve to the services, or the interfaces. I can't speak all of a sudden. So what should happen, right? And I think before that gets, it's already running. So spoiler alert, but let's make this a little bigger. We can see the first resolved instance, we print 2, we print this hash code. The second resolved instance, we print 2, this same hash code, print 2 after, enter to exit. So in this example, I'm just going to jump back to new module. This is still overridden, right? That didn't change. And you'll see that the hash code is the same. And the reason why that's the case is that I made a single instance of this, of original, right? So that means when we go to do the wiretap, we're always using the same instance. Okay, now what if you don't want that? Okay, so anytime now someone asks to resolve this, we should get a new instance. So we should see the hash codes are different. This is why I wanted to put the hash code in the output. So I'll run this again. Again, like as I'm talking about this is something I was still kind of exploring. Like, I don't know what the right answer should be in terms of using this. I don't know what's wrong, what's right. I'm just trying to figure out where things are different and what we can play around with. Okay, so something interesting happened here. So to me, this feels wrong. And you'll see that now we have print 1 before, then print 2 before, and then 2, 1. So we actually got double wiretapping. Okay, so we got double wiretapping, and you'll see that this hash code is different. And this is why a couple things feel wrong about this. We only wiretapped the first resolution of this. Okay, so what I mean by that is we said in the program, go resolve one of them and print it out, which is this part. And we got a double wiretap. And then we resolved it again. We got a new interface, but you'll see there's no wiretap, right? There's nothing that says print before and after. So no wiretap occurred on this resolution. But like, I think we probably would have expected that, right? So that to me feels kind of not right. I don't know what the expected behavior is, but this is something that as I'm walking through a lot of these scenarios, I would try to take these scenarios, go write up some unit tests for them, and then kind of make this matrix of like, you know, put all the expected behavior and make it work. So I'm going to put single instance back, and then I'm going to talk about some of the other stuff I was doing with this extension method. So I did add this functionality. I didn't have a good name for it, but I called it wiretap single instance, and I made it an enum. And what it lets you do, by default, it inherits. So this is why we saw some weird functionality there. By default, it will inherit, and it's inheriting the single instance-ness, if I can make that up, the single instance-ness of this registered service. Okay, so if the original registration was single instance, and we don't want that, we can change that, right? So I'm changing a few parameters here. Now the wiretaps will always be new instances. Okay. I'm going to jump back to original. Oops. Let's get rid of that. Original module. It's still registered as a single instance. So original one is single. The wiretaps are new instances. And in program, we're still doing 2 resolutions. So I'm going to run that. And before, what we saw was the first instance got wiretapped. The second instance was a new instance, but it was not wiretapped. You can see in this case, we got the same original implementation, right? We got the same one because I made that single instance in the original module, and then both of these got double wiretapped. To me, this one feels right, and the reason why to me it feels right, or mostly right, it gets kind of weird, is that the single instanceness of the original implementation was preserved, which is what we wanted. Then I guess where you could argue is like we got both of these are now wiretapped, so that part to me feels right. I think as long as we have a wiretap in place, it should always be wiretapped. So this feels better. But what's interesting is like it's double wiretapped, right? So is that what we wanted? I'm going to jump back to the new module here. Is that what we wanted, or should we have expected that this line here actually overrides this wiretap? I don't know. That to me feels a little bit odd. I don't know if it's the right answer or not. But it doesn't feel totally consistent, so I still want to play around with that. And just one more example. So I'm going to go back to original module. I'm taking this off. Right, so now both wiretaps are new instances, and we should see that the hash codes on the original one are now also different because there is no more single instanceness of this. So I'll run that. And then once I show you this, I'm going to try stepping through some of the code to just talk about how I did the single instanceness and cache and things. So you can see like I feel like it's broken. And the reason I feel like it's broken is like we lost the wiretap on the second one again. To me, that's not right. I feel like as long as we have these 2 lines that do the wiretapping, anytime we resolve that service, we should see a wiretap. That's just how I feel about that. And then again, we still have this double wiretap on the first one. Arguable, I'm not sure. I feel like one thing that's kind of misleading right now is like maybe there's a difference between the single instance of the wrapped class being cached versus allowing multiple wrapping, like double, triple wiretapping versus overriding. I feel like I might need another parameter to define that, like override a wiretap or wiretap the wiretap, if that makes sense. So I got to still figure that out. anyway, so it's still TBD. I'll probably follow up and maybe do like a unit testing video on some of the stuff once I arrive at something that feels good and how I sort of approach the unit test to do that. But I'm going to jump back into some of this code here in the extension method, just to talk about some cool things that I was seeing, like when I was looking through some of the Autofac stuff. So um, essentially, what I was able to find is like I wanted this inherit functionality. So like if you wanted to do wiretapping and you didn't want to specify like single instance or not, like what's the default behavior? And I was like, well, I don't know what the default is. Like maybe, and maybe the user doesn't either. Maybe the person who programmed the wiretap doesn't know, and I'm not totally sold on this yet, but maybe they're not sure. And what if you just want to do like have the same single instanceness of whatever you're wrapping? So that's why I came up with this inherit idea, and I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do that, how do I know? How do I know what the original thing was marked as single instance or not? And it has a flag on the registration for the component. It actually has this sharing boolean, and from at least my understanding so far, this sharing boolean just indicates whether or not you have a single instance that will be shared. Um, some quick YouTubing and Googling kind of showed me that I think this can get a little bit more complicated because I think you can do single instance globally. I think you can do single instance per lifetime scope. I think you can do like single instance per thread or something. Anyway, like I think there's more to it than just sharing versus not. Um, I suspect that probably for most of the use cases I've ever personally seen, I've been using Autofac for a few years now, but for most instances of this I have seen, this probably would suffice. But like I said, I think there's a few oddities around like lifetime scopes and threads and some other things that maybe this gets a little bit scary to work with. So anyway, that's how I kind of did like the inherit parameter. And then essentially what I was doing was I have a static dictionary. I don't like using static stuff. Extension methods by nature are static to begin with. Just for context, I'm not going to go into detail, but I don't like using static stuff except for really, really simple extension methods. And the reason why I don't is that um, I've personally seen code where like you chain a lot of static things together, and if you want to get into what I would call like true unit testing of like checking whether or not like every line that you expect is being called the right way, you end up getting into this situation where like if you have a lot of nested static methods, you have to kind of prove that everything is being exercised or being mocked out properly. It gets really messy. I'm not saying that that's like you know like you should never use static or something like that. Just from my experience, I try to avoid it, but don't really have an option here. At least how I have this set up. I would love to come make this better, but I do have this static cache. I'm not dealing with thread safety or anything like that. Um, a lot of Autofac resolution stuff, from what I've seen at least, gets kind of done on like a single thread. Uh, have not explored Autofac in like a multi-threaded environment for doing resolution. So anyway, that's something that could be touched on. Um, yeah, what I'm doing though is saying like if someone has said that this wiretap should be a single instance, I'm caching the instances based on the container builder. Okay, and the reason why is because when you're writing an extension method, again, if it's not something you're familiar with, it just changes the syntax to look like you're saying container builder dot wiretap, but container builder never had a wiretap method. You're kind of just adding on, like you're pretending to add on this method to a class or an interface. But as a result, if you want state, you need to like have the state saved somewhere. So I'm kind of pretending that I have, a cache per container builder, and then I check in that cache to see like has someone asked for this type, and we've made one before. If so, assign the cached instance. Otherwise, go make it. And then again, if we did say single instance, let's store that instance in our cache. So that's really like the bulk of this other code that was going on. It makes it kind of messy, but as you saw as I was stepping through some of the stuff, I still think there's some weird like uh, obviously bugs just because it's unexpected behavior. It's not really defined right now. So like I said, I'd like to follow up with some like testing video on like how I decide like what behavior felt right. And the cool thing about that will be like as I'm doing that, I might have it one day where I'm like, this feels good, everything, is air quotes right, and then maybe after getting myself and maybe some other people trying it out, they might say, actually, that behavior wasn't what I expected. Like when I write this using this API, I expect, as an example, the wiretaps by default override, right? Maybe that's what they expect. Maybe they expect that they chain. I don't know. But I might decide on one thing, they might decide on another. And anyway, I'll have these tests in place. And if I want to change the behavior, what'll be really cool is that I can go change the test for the new expected behavior and just correct the code until all the tests pass. So kind of like some TDD, which might be kind of neat to go over. But yeah, I think that's mostly it. I just want to do a quick little summary. So the main idea was that we wanted to be able to, by adding a new module, we wanted to override some existing implementation that was registered in Autofac, and not only override it, but we also wanted to wrap it. We wanted to sort of be the man in the middle between the main code calling this and the original implementation. So we were able to do that by using a component registration and hooking up to the activated event or activating event. And when we do that, we get the original instance that it wants to provide, like Autofac wants to provide, and then we can do something with it. So we can actually just return a whole new object instead, which is kind of cool. And then I think just because I saw it, one thing that's worth mentioning is that when we use this method, we don't have to have these in a particular order. Okay, so because we're not relying on that behavior of Autofac taking the last registration between modules, we can sort of register these modules in any order we want and still get this wiretapping behavior. So just a subtle thing, but worth calling out as well. So I think that's it. Autofac's super powerful, does a lot of really cool things, and I'm kind of excited to see like if I can change this API and the extension methods into something that feel a little bit better to use, a little bit more obvious in terms of the expected behavior. So better naming, maybe some more clear parameters and stuff like that. But yeah, that'll be the next steps, I think. So thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed that.